Snow was falling in heavy, wet flakes, smothering the sound of distant artillery and swallowing the light from a gray, tired sky. By dawn, it would cover the broken fences, the frozen fields, and the narrow country road that led to a bridge nobody at headquarters even cared to mark with a thick line on the map. For the officers far in the rear, this bridge was nothing. A minor crossing in the middle of the Ardennes, a thin pencil stroke over a nameless river, far away from where they believed the real German push would come. To them, it was just another dot in a forest of dots. To the 19-year-old standing guard on its icy planks, it was the only thing that mattered. Private Francis Curry pulled his scarf higher over his mouth and stamped his boots against the frozen boards. The wood groaned under him, stiff from the cold. His breath came out in pale clouds, vanishing into the December air as quickly as his patience. He had been awake for most of the night, listening, not for the wind, not for the river moving sluggishly beneath the ice. He was listening for engines, not the tired cough of American trucks or the wheeze of overworked jeeps, but the deep, steady animal growl only German steel could make when it rolled through the dark. He had heard it once before, months earlier, from too close, when a line of Panzer tanks had crawled out of the morning mist like monsters in a fever dream. Men he had eaten breakfast with an hour earlier had been gone by lunch. He had learned that sound. You never forgot it. Francis glanced over his shoulder. On the far side of the bridge, through a curtain of falling snow, he could see the outline of the village. A few stone houses, a church steeple, a barn with its roof sagging under the weight of winter. Behind those walls, his platoon was sleeping in shifts, warming their hands over weak stoves, writing letters they might never send. To them, this was a quiet sector. To the maps, this was a quiet sector. To the 19-year-old on the bridge, it felt like the quiet you get just before a door's kicked in. He shifted his rifle, trying to shake off the unease. The Ardennes were supposed to be calm. The brass had said so. The main German effort was expected somewhere else, through terrain that made more sense for tanks, through roads that could handle a real offensive. This was the backwater, the boring assignment. But the forest did not feel boring. The trees hunched over the road like a row of listening men, branches heavy, waiting. The snow muffled everything, turning every crack and pop into something suspicious. Hours earlier, just before midnight, Francis had heard it. A faint, distant rumble. At first, he thought it was the echo of artillery from another sector. Then it came again, slower, heavier, with a rhythm that made his stomach tighten. Tracks, not tires, engines, not guns. He had reported it to the lieutenant. "Probably just supply traffic," the officer had said, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his breath smelling of coffee and cigarettes. "Jerry's moving stuff around. They can't push armor through here, not in this weather. Go back to your post, Curry. Keep your ears open, that's all." Keep your ears open. As if he could close them. So he had gone back to the bridge, and now he stood alone on the slick frozen boards, the river whispering beneath him, the sky pressing down, the forest staring. 19 years old enough to be trusted with a rifle, a sector, and a promise he had no idea how to keep. Hold the bridge. He looked down at the water below. The current was slow but relentless, carrying thin plates of ice under the arches. If tanks tried to cross here, if something went wrong, there would be nowhere to go. No room to maneuver, no way to escape. It was a perfect choke point. He could see that even if no one else seemed to care. A single destroyed vehicle on the span and everything behind it would be trapped. Blocked. Forced to stop and fight on ground they didn't choose. He clenched his jaw. If he could see that, the enemy could see it too. Behind him, the village clock chimed faintly, the sound dulled by the snow. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. A door opened, a strip of yellow light cut the night, then disappeared again. Life, small and fragile, pretending the forest was not full of men with rifles just like his, on the other side of a line nobody could actually see. Francis thought of home, of a kitchen that always smelled of coffee, of his mother turning from the stove when the radio mentioned the word front, of his father pretending not to listen, pretending to check something in the shed whenever casualty numbers came up. He wondered what they would think if they could see him now, just a dark shape on a forgotten bridge, trying to decide if he was hearing ghosts in the night or the first echo of something much worse. The wind shifted. For a moment the forest seemed to breathe. Somewhere far away, something thudded, then another, like distant footsteps. It might have been artillery. It might have been something else. He tightened his grip on the rifle and forced himself to breathe slowly. Fear, he had learned, was like frost. If you let it settle, it would creep into your fingers, your voice, your decisions. He did not have the luxury of bad decisions. A pair of boots scraped behind him. He turned. Sergeant Miller trudged up onto the bridge, his helmet dusted white, his face half hidden behind a scarf. He looked older than he was, the lines around his eyes carved there by mud, smoke, and too many names read off too many lists. "Cold enough for you, kid?" the sergeant muttered, coming to stand beside him. "Feels like the whole world froze," Francis replied, eyes still on the road vanishing into the trees. Miller followed his gaze. "Still thinking about that noise you heard?" Francis nodded. "It wasn't trucks, Sarge, not the way it carried. It was heavier, slower." "Tanks?" "Felt like it." Miller sighed, breath steaming in the air. "Command says this sector is low priority. They don't think Jerry is crazy enough to push armor through these woods in this weather." Francis finally turned his head. Maybe they're wrong. Miller studied him for a moment. The kid's eyes were too old for 19. He had seen that look before, the way men stared at the horizon when their gut knew something their orders didn't. "You're not the first to say that," the sergeant admitted quietly. "Other outposts have been hearing things too. Engines at night, tracks on the move. Nothing confirmed, nothing clear." "Maybe by the time it's clear, it'll be too late," Francis said. Miller almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You thinking of rewriting the battle plan for the whole front, Private?" "I'm thinking this bridge isn't as unimportant as they say," Francis answered. "If they get armor across here and we're not ready, they won't stop in this village. They'll go straight through us and into everything behind." The sergeant looked at the river, at the narrow road, at the forest choking it on both sides. He didn't need a map to see the logic. He knew choke points when he saw them. War had taught him that. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. Francis hesitated only a second. "Let me take a better look at the approaches. Both sides, the banks, the supports. If tanks are coming this way, we need more than just a couple of guys with rifles standing in the middle." Miller snorted softly. "That sounds a lot like you volunteering for extra work." "I'd rather work now than run later," Francis said. Silence stretched between them, filled with the whisper of falling snow and the low murmur of the river. Finally, the sergeant nodded. "All right. At first light, you go with a small team. You check the ground. If you see anything that looks like a gift for a tank column, you tell me. We're not engineers and we're not a demolition squad, but if Jerry really is stupid enough to drive his armor over this bridge, I don't want him to enjoy the trip." A thin smile touched Francis's lips. "Understood, Sarge." Miller clapped him on the shoulder and turned back toward the village. "Try to stay half alive until morning, kid. If your gut is right, we're going to have a busy day." When the sergeant's footsteps faded, Francis was alone again, with the snow, the river, and the road. He shifted his stance and stared into the forest until his eyes burned. Somewhere out there, beyond the trees and the hills, engines were waking up, fuel lines were being checked. Crews were climbing into cramped metal hulls, buttoning their jackets, lighting nervous cigarettes. Orders were being given, maps were being folded, arrows were being drawn that ended on places just like this bridge. He could not hear the words, he could not see the maps, but he could feel the weight of those decisions rolling toward him like a storm. He looked down one last time at the frozen water moving under his boots. In a few hours, this bridge might be nothing more than burning wreckage. Or it might still stand. Whether it became one or the other might depend on whether a 19-year-old boy could see what older men chose to ignore. Francis Curry took a long, cold breath and made his choice. If the enemy came this way, this bridge would not be a road. It would be a trap, and he would be the one to spring it. Morning came slowly, as if the sky itself was reluctant to reveal what the night had been hiding. The snow had not stopped. It only changed its rhythm, falling in smaller, sharper flakes that stung the skin and blurred the edges of the world. Francis Curry walked the road leading away from the bridge with his collar up and his eyes open, a small scouting team spread out behind him. 3 men, 4 rifles, 1 pair of binoculars, and a single unspoken question running between them. What exactly are we expecting to find? On paper, this was routine. Check the approaches. Verify there were no signs of enemy patrols, no hidden positions, no fresh tracks. In reality, Francis was not looking for soldiers. He was looking for roads, more precisely, for how a column of tanks would see those roads. He stopped where the trees pressed in closest to the narrow strip of asphalt, their branches hanging low and heavy with snow. The road dipped gently and then climbed toward the bridge, vanishing behind a mild curve that robbed drivers of a clear view. To someone sitting in a steel hull, this stretch would look harmless. Tight, yes, but harmless. Francis saw something else. "Look at this," he said quietly, waving the others closer. Corporal Diaz trudged up beside him, breathing hard into the cold air. "What am I looking at? Trees and more trees." "Not just trees," Francis replied. "Cover, masking. The bridge isn't visible from back there until you're almost on top of it. If you're leading a tank column, you don't see the choke point until you've already committed half your line into this funnel." He pointed with the barrel of his rifle. "The road is higher than the ground on both sides. Soft shoulders, ditches, snow. If they try to pull off in a hurry, they'll bog down or expose their flanks." Diaz squinted, following the logic. "You're saying if someone were crazy enough to hit a tank column here, they'd do it right where the road bends?" Francis nodded. "You don't hit tanks where they're comfortable. You hit them where they have the least room to think." Behind them, Private Nolan kicked at a frozen clump of earth. "So what, we just wait here with grenades and hope nobody notices we're committing suicide?" "Not here," Francis said. "Not in the open. The bridge is the key. This stretch just tells us how they'll arrive." He let his gaze travel from the curve to the distant outline of the bridge, faint through the curtain of snow. From this vantage point, he could see it more like an enemy would, a narrow, man-made throat cut through the forest, the only fast way across the water for something as heavy as a tank. "Let's check the banks," he said. "If I were driving armor and didn't trust the bridge, I'd look for a crossing here first." The team worked their way down the slope, boots sliding on the packed snow until they reached the riverbank. The water moved slow and dark beneath a crust of broken ice. Branches floated by like dead fingers. Diaz threw a small stone. It skipped once, punched through the ice, and vanished. "Doesn't look like a good place to swim," he muttered. Francis scanned both sides, measuring distances in his head. The banks were uneven, cut by roots and hidden rocks. On one side, the ground rose too sharply to offer an easy exit for something with tracks and tons of armor. On the other, the mud beneath the snow looked treacherous. "They won't risk taking heavy armor through this," he said. "Not in winter, not with the current and the slope like this. For tanks, the bridge is the only real option." "Which makes it the worst place for us to stand and wave at them," Nolan grumbled. Francis didn't argue. He simply turned his eyes to the underside of the structure itself. From below, the bridge looked less like a road and more like a skeleton. Support beams, joints, places where stone met steel, lines of weakness hidden inside the lines of strength. "How much explosive do we actually have?" he asked. Diaz shrugged. "Enough to make a mess, not enough to erase this thing from the map. We're not exactly swimming in supplies out here." Francis knelt, brushing snow from one of the stone supports. The cold bit his gloves, crept into his bones, but his mind ran hot. "We don't have to erase it," he said slowly. "We just have to break it in the right place, at the right time." He traced the line where the support met the underside of the road. "If the first tank is on the span when this section goes, it doesn't matter if the whole bridge collapses. One crippled vehicle, half hanging off the edge, is enough to seal this tight." Diaz whistled low. "You want to drop the lead tank into the river?" "I want to make sure it can't move forward and nothing behind it can get past," Francis replied. "If we do that, the rest of the column stacks up in the kill zone. Limited visibility, nowhere to turn, no room to maneuver. They'll be stuck on a narrow road with angry men on both sides." Nolan shook his head. "You sound way too calm about pissing off a line of tanks." Francis stood, brushing snow from his knees. "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm just more scared of what happens if we don't do anything at all." They spent the next hour walking the banks, counting paces, marking spots in their minds. Every rock, every dip, every clump of trees became part of an invisible map only they could see. A map not of positions, but of possibilities. By the time they climbed back toward the village, the snow was falling harder. The bridge loomed ahead, its surface already whitening again, hiding their footprints. It looked innocent. It would not stay that way. In the makeshift command post, a commandeered farmhouse smelling of damp wood and cold coffee, Lieutenant Harris was bent over a map when they came in. Lines, arrows, and colored pins covered the paper, but the bridge itself was little more than a symbol. He looked up as the door opened, a draft of icy air following the men inside. "Well, see any German patrols? Any flags with little black crosses on them?" "No patrols," Francis answered. "No flags, just terrain." Harris tapped the map with a pencil. "We already know the terrain, Private." "With respect, sir," Francis said carefully, "we know it from this side of the paper. The enemy will see it differently, especially if they're bringing armor." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "We're not confirming any armor movements in this sector. Higher command says that they'd be crazy to push tanks through here in winter," Francis finished for him. "I know, sir, but crazy things have been happening every day for the last week. We keep hearing engines at night. Other units are reporting the same. If they do come this way, this bridge becomes the only artery that matters." Harris stared at him, balancing irritation against something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the quiet pressure of a fear he didn't want to name. "What exactly are you proposing, Curry?" he asked at last. Francis stepped closer to the table and pointed at the map. "Sir, the banks are too steep and unstable for heavy armor to ford the river nearby. The ground is soft under the snow. If they want to move tanks through this corridor, they have to use the bridge." He tapped the symbol again. "This is their only real option. That makes it our opportunity." The lieutenant folded his arms. "You want to destroy the bridge?" "No, sir," Francis said. "Not completely. We don't have the explosives for that, and even if we did, we might need it later. I'm saying we prepare it. We weaken specific points. We wire charges to bring down just enough of the span to trap the first vehicle that rolls onto it." Diaz spoke up from the side. "If the lead tank goes down or blocks the way, the rest are stuck on the road. They'll be nose to tail, sir. We saw the approach. Forest tight on both sides, no room to fan out," Francis continued. "If we set up our main positions here and here," he indicated the flanks near the bridge approaches, "and keep a reserve further back in the village, we can turn their column into a shooting gallery. They won't see the full extent of the trap until they're already committed." Harris leaned back, expression unreadable. "You're talking about deliberately inviting a tank attack onto our position, with a handful of infantry, a couple of machine guns, and whatever anti-tank toys we can scrape together." "Yes, sir," Francis replied, "because if we don't, and they choose this route anyway, we won't just be fighting for this bridge, we'll be running from it." Silence dropped over the room, thick as the snow outside. The lieutenant's eyes moved from the map to the young soldier's face. Francis didn't look away. Finally, Harris exhaled through his nose. "Sergeant Miller, how much demolition material do we have left?" Miller, who had been hovering quietly near the stove, straightened. "Enough for a few decent bangs, sir. Not enough to take down a whole damn river crossing. But maybe enough to do what the kid is talking about, if we're careful with placement." Harris rubbed his temples. "If higher command hears I let a 19-year-old talk me into turning this bridge into a booby trap for tanks—" "Sir," Francis said softly, "if they never hear about it, that will mean the plan failed. And if the plan fails, I don't think we'll be around to explain it." The lieutenant stared at him for another long second. Then something in his shoulders gave way, not in defeat, but in decision. "Fine," he said. "We do this your way, within reason. Sergeant, pull 2 men who can handle a shovel without dying. Get the explosives out of storage. Curry, you walk them through what you saw. You pick the points, Miller handles the wiring. I want this done before dark." He jabbed a finger at Francis. "But understand this, we are buying time, not glory. The moment this turns into a slaughter we can't control, we fall back to the village and hold there. I'm not losing the whole platoon to one bridge and one idea." "Yes, sir," Francis said. But inside, he was already turning the new pieces over in his mind. Work began before the sun even tried to break through the clouds. Men moved like shadows across the white landscape, carrying crates, coils of cable, and canvas-wrapped bundles that clinked faintly with lethal promise. The bridge, moments ago just away across the water, became a construction site for a different kind of architecture, one built out of timing, fear, and steel. Underneath the span, Miller directed the placement of the charges with the precision of a man who had learned to respect both explosives and gravity. Francis pointed out the joints and supports he wanted targeted, thinking not like an engineer, but like an enemy driver. "Here," he said, tapping a beam with the back of his glove. "If this goes while a tank is right above it, the weight and momentum will do half the work. Even if the bridge doesn't collapse completely, the vehicle won't be going anywhere fast." "And the one behind it?" Miller asked. "Will be too close and too heavy to stop clean," Francis answered. "With limited visibility and panic kicking in, there's a good chance they'll either rear-end the first tank or swerve into the side, tearing tracks or jamming themselves half sideways. One broken machine, one nervous driver, and the rest start making mistakes." Diaz, crouched nearby with a coil of wire over his shoulder, snorted. "You talk about tanks like they're livestock." Francis managed a brief, humorless smile. "Big, angry metal cows. You don't fight them head-on. You spook them into the pen and slam the gate." By midday, the underside of the bridge bristled with carefully hidden charges, each one wired to a firing point concealed in a sandbagged position overlooking the span. The wires disappeared into the snow, blending with roots and shadows, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Above, other men were digging in along the approaches, foxholes behind stone walls, machine guns in shattered windows, rifle pits covered with branches and white sheets. Every position had a field of fire marked in someone's mind, every angle of approach measured against the idea that soon, very soon, this quiet place might roar. Francis moved from post to post, checking lines of sight, adjusting small details. "Shift a little left. Don't bunch up here. If they spot this nest, fall back to that doorway, not into the open." Some of the older soldiers bristled at taking direction from someone barely old enough to shave, but there was something in the way he looked at the ground, the way he talked about the enemy's likely reactions, that made them listen anyway. As the light began to die, the village changed character. It no longer looked like a cluster of homes waiting for spring. It looked like teeth. Back at the firing point wired to the bridge charges, Francis knelt beside the detonator box, his gloved fingers tracing the worn edges of the casing. This small, ugly device now held the hinge of the entire plan. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early, and they would only damage the span and alert the enemy. Too late, and the lead tank would be across, turning its turret, spitting fire into their positions. Miller crouched beside him. "You understand what you're asking for, kid?" he said quietly. "You'll be the one who decides when to push that plunger. If you freeze, if you misjudge the distance or the weight or the speed, we all get to find out what it feels like to be under a tank tread." Francis stared at the bridge, at the snow, at the dark line of trees where the road disappeared. "I know," he said. His voice did not shake. His hands almost did. Miller studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because whether we like it or not, this is your show now. The lieutenant might have signed off on it, but you're the one who designed the curtain drop." Night rolled in early, swallowing color and sharpening shadows. The men settled into their positions, weapons cleaned and loaded, eyes burning from strain and cold. The village held its breath. The river whispered beneath the bridge, unaware that it might soon be asked to swallow steel and fire. In a small dugout overlooking the span, Francis sat with his back against the frozen earth, the detonator box resting on his knees like a sleeping animal. Every now and then, he lifted his head and listened. For a while there was nothing but wind and the occasional creak of settling wood. Then, sometime past midnight, it came again. A low, distant, growing growl. Not thunder, not artillery, engines, multiple. They were still far away, but closer than the night before, closer than anyone could pretend not to hear. One of the nearby riflemen swallowed hard. "You think they're really coming here?" Francis did not answer immediately. He watched the darkness beyond the tree line, feeling the vibration in his bones before it touched his ears. "Yes," he said at last, "they're coming." He looked down at the detonator, then back at the bridge. Hours from now, this quiet piece of wood and stone could be a wall of flame, or a grave, or both. The men around him shifted, checked weapons, muttered short, unfinished prayers. On most maps, this place was still a thin line with no name. To Francis Curry, it was now something else entirely. It was a question with only two possible answers. Either his plan would hold, or a column of German steel would roll straight through it and crush everything behind. He wrapped his fingers around the handle of the detonator and made himself a promise. When the first tank rolled onto that bridge, he would not hesitate. He had turned the crossing into a trap. Now, all that was left was to wait for something big enough and dangerous enough to walk into it. Dawn never really came. The sky just turned from black to a dirty, bruised gray, and the snowlight made the world glow in a cold, sick way. The men on the line woke not because of orders, but because of the sound. It started as a tremor in the ground. Cups rattled in their saucers. Ice dust shivered from beams and rafters. Then the air itself began to vibrate. Engines, not one, not two, many. Francis pressed his eye to the slit of his position overlooking the bridge. The road beyond the trees was a pale vein cutting through the dark trunks. The sound grew, became layered. The deep growl of tank motors, the harsher clatter of half-tracks, the impatient rev of motorcycles. "Contact!" a whisper came over to him from the forward observer's hole. "Column on the road, multiple armor. They're coming straight in." His heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. This was it. No more maps, no more guessing. All that was left was timing. "Hold your fire," Francis said, loud enough for the nearest positions to hear, quiet enough not to carry. No one shoots until the bridge. The first shape emerged out of the tree line, dark, low, and massive, snow dusting its armor. A German tank. Behind it, another and another. A long line of metal and hate, nose to tail along the narrow road. They advanced cautiously at first, barrels sweeping, machine guns twitching over the silent forest. But nothing moved. No shots came. To them, it must have seemed like the rumors were right. This sector was empty, abandoned, forgotten. The lead tank rolled closer, treads chewing up the snow, leaving twin scars in the white. Its engine roared as it climbed the slight rise toward the span. The second tank followed, the third right on its heels. Francis's fingers tightened around the detonator handle. His whole world shrank to a single frame, the heavy vehicle, the boards of the bridge, the invisible charges buried in its bones. "Closer," he whispered to himself. "Come on, just a little closer." The tank's nose reached the start of the bridge. Board by board, the monster crawled out over the river. Francis waited until he felt the weight of it, until he knew in his gut that tens of tons of steel were pressing down exactly where he needed them. He exhaled. "Now!" He slammed the handle down. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the bridge bucked like a living thing. The explosion ripped through wood and stone, tearing up from underneath with a roar that swallowed every other sound. The span rose, shattered, and dropped in a shower of splinters and smoke. The lead tank lurched, one side of its tread suddenly hanging in empty air. Its hull crashed down at an angle, groaning, its front buried, its rear still on the span. Behind it, the second tank tried to stop and had nowhere to go. Momentum drove it forward. It slammed into the crippled vehicle with a grinding scream of metal, crumpling its own front, tracks twisting, turret jerking sideways. The road became a bottleneck of steel. "Now!" Francis shouted. The silent village erupted. Machine guns hammered from shattered windows. Rifles cracked in sharp, disciplined bursts. From the flanks, anti-tank rounds streaked out, slamming into armor plates with ugly, ringing impacts. The Germans hesitated, just for a second. It was enough. Infantry riding on the tanks bailed off, dropping into the snow, trying to find cover where there was none. Those who dove for the roadside ditches found them already sighted in. Those who ran back down the road met fire from positions they hadn't seen. The third tank tried to reverse. The road was too narrow. It slewed awkwardly, its tracks biting into the soft shoulder. One side slipped, then sunk, the vehicle tilting dangerously as its driver fought to correct. A bottle of fuel arced through the air, smashed against the back of its engine deck, and turned into a sheet of flame. Francis moved, not thinking, only acting. He left the detonator, grabbed his rifle, and scrambled to a secondary firing slit as the enemy recovered from the shock. A tank turret turned, the black mouth of its gun hunting for the muzzle flashes that were ripping into its escort. He saw it starting to swing toward a building where two of his men were pinned. Without hesitation, he snatched up a rifle grenade, jammed it onto the launcher cup, and braced himself. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he barely felt it. The grenade arced over the burning wreck at the front of the bridge and dropped straight onto the exposed commander's hatch of the second tank. The explosion punched fire and fragments into the opening. The tank's machine gun went slack, its turret slowing, then freezing mid-turn. "Keep them in the funnel," Francis yelled. "Don't let them spread." The Germans tried anyway. Some vehicles in the rear of the column attempted to turn around, creating a tangle of steel and panic. Orders screamed in German, engines revved too hard, tracks slipped on ice, bit into flesh. Every attempt to form a proper line of battle just made the chaos worse. From his position, Francis saw shapes breaking away, small groups of infantry trying to rush the bridge on foot, hoping to clear a path or flank the American positions. He shifted his fire, picking targets not by rank or insignia, but by movement. The man waving his arm to signal others, the one dropping into a firing kneel, the one dragging a machine gun forward. One by one, they fell. For a moment, a tank in the rear finally found an angle. Its gun lowered, pointed almost directly at Francis's position. He saw the flash inside the barrel, felt the instinct to duck before he actually moved. The shot hit low, pulverizing the earth in front of his slit, blasting mud, snow, and shards of rock into his face. The breath was punched out of his lungs. His ears rang. He tasted blood. He forced himself up again, wiping his eyes with the back of his glove. The world swam, then steadied. The tank was adjusting, preparing a second, cleaner shot. "Here!" someone shouted from another window, firing wildly to draw its attention. The turret twitched, indecisive. Before it could choose, a hidden anti-tank gun further back finally found its mark. The shell slammed into the side of the hull with a crack like a snapped bone. Flame burst from the seams of the armor. The tank shuddered, then sagged, its engine coughing, dying. The battle did not last hours. On a clock, it was probably less than one. But for everyone on that bridge, it stretched into a lifetime cut into seconds. The second a trigger was pulled, the second a grenade left a hand, the second a decision turned survival into death, or the other way around. When the firing finally died down, when the last German attempt to push forward broke and fled back into the tree line, the world exhaled. Smoke hung over the bridge like a dirty halo. The river was choked with debris, planks, twisted metal, pieces of things that had once been vehicles. The air stank of fuel, hot metal, and the sharp copper note of blood. Francis pulled himself out of the dugout, boots slipping on churned snow darkened with mud and worse. He walked toward the bridge in a daze, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. The lead tank was still there, nose buried, rear lifted, frozen forever in the moment of its fall. Behind it, the second vehicle leaned into its back like a dead animal that had tried to climb over a fence and failed. Further down the road, other shapes smoked, some still flickering with stubborn flames. Sergeant Miller limped up beside him, face gray under the soot. He looked at the wreckage, then at the younger man. "You did it," he said simply. "Your damn trap worked." Francis stared at the broken line of German armor, at the bodies scattered along the road and in the ditches. He did not feel like a hero. He felt tired, older. "It wasn't just me," he murmured. "It was everyone who held when they could have run." Miller shook his head. "Plenty of men held lines today. Not many stopped a tank column with a bridge and an idea." In the hours that followed, reports would be written, numbers would be counted, destroyed vehicles, enemy dead, own casualties. They would argue over how many tanks exactly had been stopped here, how much time this small, savage ambush had bought for units further back. On some map in some warm room, an officer would circle this nameless bridge and write a brief note about successful delaying action. The words would be small, the impact would not. As the adrenaline finally started to drain, Francis stood on what remained of the span and looked down at the dark water moving beneath the wreckage. Hours ago, this had been just a crossing. He had turned it into a trap, and when the column came, he had sprung it. 19 years old, covered in soot and snow, he watched the river carry away shards of steel and ash and thought of how close it had come to being his own body down there instead. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted his name. The lieutenant wanted him. There would be words, commendations, questions, maybe even promises of medals. But for the moment, he stayed where he was, boots planted on the bridge that was no longer a road but a grave marker. In the bitter quiet after the battle, one truth settled into his bones. For a single frozen morning in the Ardennes, a 19-year-old nobody had stood between a column of panzers and everything they were trying to reach. and the tanks had not passed.